Once again, there's been a recurrence of conflict between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza, but this time was different. There were clashes in Israel itself between Jewish and Arab citizens, and a raid inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the second holiest site in the Islamic faith. The world is relieved that the killing has stopped and a ceasefire is now in place. However, after previous outbreaks of violence, calm's been restored, and then one or the other party commits an action, and we're back again in a situation where there's conflict and violence. My guest today is Professor of Journalism at Wits University, Anton Harber. I asked Anton to join me not to talk about the conflict per se, but its coverage in the media. You see, many journalists, editors, and media owners are genuinely intimidated by the prospect of covering the region, particularly Israel-Palestine, during conflict. What makes it that way? Why are they so wary, Anton?
Well, covering any conflict is difficult for journalists. Covering conflict which has such history, such passion, such complexity. You know, it's hard in every story to capture a balanced perspective on the complicated and difficult history that lies behind the story. So, yes, you can say this happened yesterday and this happened now, but you can't understand or explain the story without grappling with deep, deep difficulty and complexity. And that makes it, and of course, it raises huge amounts of passion on both sides. So it's very hard not to draw the ire, the response, the criticism, the attacks from one or other party.
Are you saying context matters here? I mean, how far back do you go? A few hundred years to the Balfour Declaration? What happens? I mean, how do you cover this story without going back, or if you're covering it going forward? What does it mean?
Well, that's a very interesting question. But even if one looks at the short term, where does one say the spark came for this conflict? Was it the Hamas rockets? Was it the incident at the Al-Aqsa Mosque just before that? Was it the previous incident that's emerged in some reports at the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Is it when they started to try and evict Palestinians from West Jerusalem? A lot of where you start to tell just this story reflects what your view is on it, because you know, one reads reports that says, I read one today that said this conflict was sparked by Hamas firing rockets at Israel, and of course there were many who would say that was merely a response to a provocative incident at Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Okay, so but you're the professor of journalism at Wits University. You're bringing the next cadre of great journalists into South African newsrooms. What advice would you be giving them? Because journalists' job is to look at the truth and supposedly objectively convey that to the watching public.
Well, objective is not a word I use, because we all have our prejudices, we all have our views. What we try and learn as journalists and try and teach as journalists is how to manage transparently those biases and those emotions in order to try and get to the truth and not let it unbalance one's story. You know, when there's horror, when there's death, when there's bombs, the idea of balance becomes very complicated. But I think we have to say it's our job as journalists to try and probe through the immediate, you know, report what's happening now and recently, but try and probe through to give a greater explanation and understanding of the complexities of this very difficult conflict.
All right, so when you've watched how the coverage has been this time around from various media, and particularly let's talk about mainstream media, CNN, Al Jazeera, etc., have you noticed any shift or difference between what happened in the conflict previously?
Well, let me say this first. To a large extent, this is a conflict about media, about public opinion, about global opinion. Both sides have limited military ambitions in this conflict, which is why the ceasefire, I think, is likely to hold. They don't have any great hope of going all out to defeat one another. They're trying to score limited tactical goals, and they're playing to their internal politics on both sides. So a lot of it is about capturing global opinion, because global opinion is so important on this. And that's why they put so much into trying to capture global opinion. To answer your question, I think it's very significant that we've seen a tidal change, a very significant change in the coverage globally of this conflict. It was not long ago when Israel could rely on the sympathy of most of global media, particularly Western media. And that was the case for many, many years, and it reflected the politics in that country, and that has changed.
Why has it changed?
It's changed for a number of reasons. I think the first one is because of social media. Previously, we did not hear many Palestinian voices. We didn't get much coverage from the ground in the West Bank or Gaza, for example, or in West Jerusalem. Social media changes that. It means the mainstream media are no longer the gatekeepers. They're no longer the agenda setters. It can be driven through social media. And of course, with the ubiquity of cameras, it means video footage is there all the time to capture what's happening on the ground. So we are seeing and hearing much more from the Palestinian voice than we heard before. There are other factors. I think Israel's conduct towards the media recently has alienated even some sympathetic media. I mean, when you're bombing those who are trying to be on the ground to cover things in Gaza or the West Bank, when you're bombing not them but the building they operate from.
Some said that when AP, the building housing AP and Al Jazeera was bombed, it was a way for, some say, Israel to stop that coverage directly from the site. But surely that isn't the case anymore for exactly the points you've just made, that voices can be heard through other medium, through other social media.
You can't stop it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that they were two of the very few media who are based and closer to what's happening on the ground in these territories. So when they're targeting them, not targeting their building, you have to think maybe they want less of that kind of on-the-ground coverage from within the Palestinian territory.
When there are two adversaries in any conflict, does the power dynamic matter in the way that journalists report? The fact that one is considered more powerful than the other, militarily and otherwise. Does it matter to journalists when they cover conflict?
That's an interesting question, and the answer, I think, is yes. But as I say, things have changed, because previously it was Israel that had the mighty media machine that generally was able to do a lot of setting the agenda on the story, and that's been broken down by social media. But yes, it's clear in the depiction of the whole story where the real power lies here. It's Israel's military dominance is without question, and Israel's economic and other strength and other power is without question. And that, I think that affects the way people see who is the victim here, because the media struggle is to be portrayed as the victim. Israel saying, but we're under attack from 4,000 rockets, which no doubt is a terrifying situation to be in. The Palestinians, of course, saying, we want our land, our houses, we're under attack as civilians. There's a kind of media competition to say we are the victims. It's harder to portray yourself as the victim when you are the very powerful one.
Of course. Very important point that I've pondered many times when we've had this conflict is there are times when there are accusations made about Israel's complicity in certain things, and almost immediately there's a pushback that says that behavior or that comment or that criticism is anti-Semitic. When is the accusation of anti-Semitism valid and when isn't it?
So that's a difficult and complex question, and it's one that within the Jewish community is being hotly debated. Because yes, more conservative Zionists are saying almost any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And we do hear some of the Israeli leadership saying or implying that. Whereas many others are saying it's not just anti-Semitic, but many Jews are being critical of Israeli conduct and behavior. So where does it lie? It lies in when you automatically assume that Jews support what Israel's doing. It lies when you take criticism of Israel and imply it's criticism of Jews. But mostly it's when people resort, and I've seen this a few times in the last couple of weeks, to using anti-Semitic tropes, the long-standing tropes of anti-Semitism that spark reaction, a gut reaction from Jewish people who've seen it so often, so many times, and so terribly. So that's the key thing. I mean, I watched an interview on CNN with a Pakistani foreign minister the other night, who started to say, but Jews control the media. And of course, that falls right into an anti-Semitic trope and needs to be tackled head on.
Mm. So when you think about tomorrow and the next day, because this is not the end, there will be another occasion where there'll be conflict again. Do you think that media's coverage continues to evolve differently than what you would have expected 10 years ago?
Yes, I think as media changes, as the technology changes, as the balance of power around the world changes, then it does change and it does evolve. You know, I think the Black Lives Matter movement in America has affected coverage because it's created a greater sensitivity in many parts of America towards issues of discrimination, inequality, prejudice, etc. So, I mean, we saw passionate speeches in support of the Palestinians and critical of Israel in the American Congress, which is a very rare thing. We saw it this week. So that shift in American politics, I think, has also affected the coverage and the way people see international and global issues like Israel-Palestine.
Thank you, Anton Harber. Anton, you're going to stay with us. We've still got a conversation coming, and this time it's not specifically about the Israel-Palestinian conflict.